I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. I'm going to end up discussing transphobia. If that's not something you feel like you can listen to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this episode. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a monthly podcast where I discuss queer cinema. I divide the months up by genre, and this month we are laughing through the tears because we're discussing comedy. And this film in particular ruffled some feathers. If you haven't been listening to the previous episodes in the season of the show, I've been focusing on films that they've either been like the subject of discourse or they are particularly offensive and have had many think pieces written about them. Basically because I think I wanted to, reevaluate what it is we become obsessed with and what it is that we choose as a community to focus our attention on, and whether that discourse was justified, as well as, evaluating if the film is even worth watching in the first place. If you've read the title for this episode, then you probably already know the film that I'm talking about. I'm going to say it anyway. This month's film is Adam.
So Casey's like that guy on the show, right? Like he used to be a girl, now he's a guy?
Yeah, he's trans.
Yeah, but he's not like a real guy with like a penis.
Trans guys are real guys, Adam. It has nothing to do with having a penis, okay?
Yeah, but if you're gay, then like...
I'm queer, whatever.
Adam is a 2019 dramedy directed by Rhys Ernst, based on the book of the same name adapted by author Ariel Schrag. It follows the titular Adam, a teenage boy who spends the summer with his sister in New York, and ends up pretending to be a trans man in order to pursue a lesbian, Jillian, who he is attracted to. What begins as a story of initial awkward misunderstanding very swiftly moves into explicit appropriation of the trans experience to find community and to not sabotage the relationship Adam has been desiring. This film was very heavily criticised for its plot, even before it was released, with accusations of it simply being a sexual fantasy for teenage boys playing out on screen and misrepresenting what it means to be an actual trans person. This was on top of allegations of mistreatment of extras on set. Before the film was even out of production, there were petitions to have it literally cancelled, and queer activists and allies had called for boycotts. There were multiple social media posts going around, including a Tumblr post stating that the film was based on a novel that this person had read, and it was the most disgustingly transphobic and lesbophobic narrative that they'd ever come across. There was also a Twitter thread from someone who was an extra in the film who accused the production team of being slimy, dishonest and exploitative. He said that he was lied to about what the film was about and that he and other queer and trans people were subjected to constant misgendering by the crew. So this was a film where there was a ton of controversy about it before it even came out, before there was even a trailer out, and the actual end result was very deliberately complicated and provocative. It's a film that tries to invert the story of coming out, making a cisgender and heterosexual audience experience what it's like to put in copious amounts of effort into assimilating. But in my opinion, it fails to account for the fact that many queer and trans people do not get to reap the benefits of said assimilation in the way that Adam does in the movie. Despite this film being generally exiled by queer people on the internet, it did actually win some awards and was nominated for quite a few others as well. So LA Outfest, Rhys Ernst, the director, won the Grand Jury Award for Outstanding Directing in a US feature, and at the Mezipatra Queer Film Festival, the film won the Grand Jury Prize for Feature Film. And as I said, it was nominated for several others. This Rotten Tomatoes score is shocking, but we'll say it anyway. The critic score is 74% and the audience score is 17%. Those might be a bit skewed. We can assume that, just a smidge. And the score on Letterboxd is 2.4. I mean, it's kind of expected. There was a similar kind of result with Stonewall, which is a film that I discussed earlier this year. There was a similar kind of score disparity between critics and audience, but it was the other way around, I think, last time. The audience score was much higher for Stonewall than the critic score was, I think. Someone's going to double check that and say, no, you're wrong. But there was definitely like a massive gap between them. I would argue that this film is more competent and more thoughtful. People might have a problem with me saying that, but I do think it's a more thoughtful film and it feels a lot more human than Stonewall ever did. And I can say this, it wasn't boring as shit, which Stonewall definitely was. But that doesn't mean it's not without its issues. I've stated many of them before I've even gotten into the film yet. I'm not surprised. I think it's interesting that a film like this, which hardly anyone saw, has like a much stronger score disparity than something like The Silence of the Lambs, right? I think both have transphobic elements in them, but this one kind of wears the stain of that more obviously. I think that's something to kind of consider, that I'm of the opinion that this film could have just flown under the radars, being like kind of like edgy but not really worth talking about, and having like a 50% audience score and then never being spoken about again, had it not gained so much traction online. I think when we discuss scores like this, and I'm not saying they're like a metric for whether a film is good or bad, I have disagreed with many a Rotten Tomatoes score, I promise you, but I do think it's interesting the way that people who haven't seen the film have contributed to how it's perceived. And I guess it's a little bit frustrating that it's hard to find like meaningful analysis of the film because you're having to like wade through synopses from people who haven't even seen the film. I want to make clear I'm not talking about people who were mistreated on set. I'll state this now. I believe their accounts. I believe that happened to them. I think like the strikes that are going on at the moment in the US kind of evidence that for a long time actors have kind of been treated like shit. So I am not necessarily surprised by their accounts. I think it gained a lot of traction specifically because it's a film about the LGBT community, and this kind of treatment was going on to people who were part of that. When I say that I'm frustrated with the way that people talked about this film, is that I have to now make an episode kind of defending it, even though I don't necessarily think that it's worth that effort, because people have skewed so far in the other direction of this is literally the worst thing to ever happen to trans people in cinema, and this is the most offensive film of all time, which I don't believe. I don't think that it's great. I think it's mostly fine. I think it could have been a lot more interesting and just generally a better satire of what it was trying to achieve. I'm just frustrated that I'm I'm having to like engage with discourse that is disingenuous when I've seen the film and I know what happens in it, and I know what is worth talking about and what is just people not being able to engage with, I guess, like anything that is even the least bit problematic, even if it's like deliberately so with the intent of dealing with that problematicness. Analysis of quote unquote bad movies should go further than this was bad, this was offensive, and this is literally gonna topple society. Like, I think we should be able to actually analyze what the film is trying to do, because I think it's a better gauge of what it means to make a queer film, like what it means to represent like really messy queer experiences, which ultimately, in my opinion, I think that's what this film is about. And I'm going to explore it in a bit, but I wanted to get that out of the way because I don't know, it feels like there's a lot of fuss for a film that it's an independent film that nobody would have seen. When it comes to like media consumption, a lot of the time it feels like people very much attach all of society to it, particularly when it comes to like marginalised groups. So I think it can be a bit frustrating when people don't have a ton of perspective. I'm going to move on to the reviews because they have some opinions. Typically, I tend to go with reviews that are most popular, but also like ones that are like funny or interesting. I wanted to get like a wide range from the reviews, but you know, I didn't want to show my bias. Many of the reviews that I personally liked were ones that were like, yeah, it's kind of complicated and messy, but I think some of the best queer films are complicated and messy. I get why people don't like it, but ultimately this was not as bad as people said it was, which is kind of my opinion. But I want to engage with the people who really didn't like it or, you know, just had an interesting thing to say. So I'm going to start with a Lizard Beth who says, literal garbage and problematic as fuck. At this point, I think the word problematic has lost all its meaning. I'll give it some leeway because I'm pretty sure this review came from 2019, so that's fine. I think a lot of people came away from the film being like, this was problematic, and then just immediately shut down and didn't want to engage with it. But I'm not like other film reviewers. This next review, a bit longer, it's from Dawson Joyce, and they say, a film that's just as horribly irresponsible, degrading and exploitative as you've heard and then some. Adam is a complete and total albatross of a film that's physically uncomfortable to watch, as it goes so far out of its way to misguidedly and nakedly play into the most bigoted and misinformed ideals regarding the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I think I don't want to discount or undermine anyone who was personally offended by the stuff in the film. A lot of the time, particularly with films that I don't like, I recognise that it's doing something, even if it's not something that I think is worthwhile doing, or I recognise that it's attempting to engage in themes, and I can be like, I recognise those themes and I recognise the way that you're going about those themes, but I just viscerally hated the experience of watching it. And I can't take that away from anyone. You know, if that's how you came away from it, then that's the end of the story. You're probably not going to want to engage with it, and that's absolutely fine. I'm going to pick out the word irresponsible because I would question what responsibility you think a filmmaker has. During my research, I remember the director talking about how often LGBT movies are very limited by what stories they can tell. There's like a checklist of what you can include and what you can't include, and they have to kind of appeal to sensibilities that aren't going to, I guess, offend people. I don't mean that in like an edgelord kind of way. I just mean that in like complication or like the messiness of people's identities, or even like gay people who are like bad people. Those kind of incur the most criticism, the most discourse around them. A symptom of film discourse online altogether. But the fact that someone would represent a bad person is kind of deeply scandalous, to offer the audience that complication, to not have a quote unquote good person as the lead character. And I think in terms of what I want from movies is that I don't necessarily want them to be like really didactic or like preachy. I personally don't think that movies are for educational purposes. I think they're there to explore identities and tackle interesting subjects. And I think whether you want to admit it or not, this is an interesting story. Like, I was kind of intrigued by it. I was on Tumblr when that post about this film came out. And I think at that time, I guess I was more black or white with how I thought about things. But I think just like the idea of it is interesting. Like, even if it's not executed well, which, you know, we can get into, it's compelling. And I think that was more the intent. I don't know if the director intended it to go as viral as it did, but I guess what I'm getting at is, what responsibility does a filmmaker have to placate the audience? And do you actually want that? This last review is from Maserati. They said, a great satire, makes cis people look really stupid, a rare focus on cis women chasers, and the way trans masculinity is fetishized. A real shame it was misunderstood. We should be allowed to satirize our own existence. Now you might think, hey, you've included this because it's something you agree with. And kind of, I guess, but it also was like a fairly popular review on Letterboxd as well. So I think maybe with time, people will be more generous to this film, which is not to say it should go down as one of the best films of all time. But I just think that coming to the conclusion that this is fine and that maybe people overreacted a smidge is okay. Like, I want messy films to be open to interpretation, because I think certain kinds of discourse just immediately shut it down. And it's frustrating because that's not what analysis is for. But I think I've spent too much time on this opening section. We haven't even got to the analysis part yet. I want to give a spoiler warning. I would recommend, if you are someone who heard about this film and immediately hated it and didn't bother to see it, I would actually recommend sitting down to watch it, because I think you'll be surprised at how kind of bland it is. I'm not going to guide you on your experience. If it surprises you, then that's great. If you still hate it, then that's also great, because you actually engaged with the film. But after this point, I am going to spoil it anyway. So if you haven't seen it, you're not allowed to get mad at me for it being spoiled, because I have warned you right now.
You see any girls you really liked? Bet some of them are bi.
Maybe.
Why don't we take a lap?
Do you really think like a girl would want to like hook up with me here?
No. I just said that so we could get away from June. Can't hang around the food table all night.
Yeah, but do you think, like, I don't know, like maybe someone would like want to hook up with me here?
Are you on crack? Everybody here is like way older than you and gay.
Everyone enjoying themselves so far.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much for having us. It's great.
Oh, that boy is fine. Excuse me.
Carla is such a little faggot.
You just said that because Skylar said that.
What?
Skylar said that earlier today. You're a follower. You copy everything everyone does, and it's it's pathetic.
Go find your own fucking life then, okay? Do you think that I want you following me around all the time? I mean, what are you even doing here? At least I belong here.
I think it can be easy to dismiss a film on being offensive or problematic based on its concept. I guess that's like, you know, how trailers work, how synopses work. You look at them and you're like, that sounds awful. I'm never going to watch that because I don't think it would play out well. Similarly, the opposite is true. You could read something and be like, that's right up my alley. In both cases, you could be wrong, because that could be a misdirection deliberately. It could be the case where it's not explored well within the film, or it was misrepresented altogether. It wasn't what it said on the tin. When talking about this film, people have boiled it down to, I guess, its worst elements, which is a cis teenage boy pretending to be a trans man in order to pursue a relationship with a lesbian. That's most of what people know about this film. When you boil it down to those elements, I guess it cuts out all of the themes that the film is trying to engage with, which is, how do we perform gender? What does it mean to be a part of a community? What does it mean to be marginalised? And how is that affected by the extent we want to assimilate? I suppose that I was more generous with this film because I'd read what the director intended with it. You know, I think I had some perspective. I didn't see the film in 2019 when it came out. I didn't see the film when people were discussing it online. I watched it in 2023 for the first time, having like years distance from the discourse and like tons of interviews with the director and a ton of like think pieces discussing what it means to make this kind of film, what it means to be cancelled before that term really kind of solidified in people's minds. The director, this is according to like several interviews that he gave, wanted to tell a story playing with the idea of mistaken identity, things that we've seen before in Twelfth Night and films like Tootsie, but inverting it and putting it through a queer lens and making the cisgender straight guy the outsider. Furthermore, the film points to a lot of grey areas in terms of real life and in terms of identity and slippages around identity. It gives a lot of complexity to the issues because they are complicated issues. So with that in mind, I guess I want to start off by looking at what the film portrays gender to be and the ways that the subjective voice of the film asks us to view things like masculinity and lesbianism. And because I guess I have that perspective of it being a deliberate choice, the ways that these are viewed by Adam as stepping stones to finding community. We see initially that Adam is very isolated. He only really has one friend and his friend doesn't really like him that much. So when he goes to New York to stay with his sister, he falls in with a bunch of really cool people, and all of these people are some variation of trans or gay. And we see the way that Adam kind of fails to live up to a cis masculinity, and when he's mistaken for a trans man, it's kind of the first time that he has something definitive to grasp onto. So we see the way that he witnesses boy Casey, who is a trans man. He's kind of portrayed as like a fuck boy, how he is able to like very confidently pursue women, you know, to the extent that he ends up like hurting girl Casey, who is Adam's sister. He ends up hurting her feelings quite a lot. But this is like the first portrayal of a out trans man, and it's someone who is very confident, who is, and I'll quote Adam when I say this, always looking in the mirror. Whereas I think Adam, the protagonist, is very much anxious when it comes to romance, when it comes to masculinity, when it comes to like fitting in and assimilating. Whereas I think initially he sees the way that this very confident trans man is able to just do it and isn't really ashamed. I'm not saying necessarily that boy Casey is particularly complex representation of trans men. I wouldn't argue that at all. I think he's a very flat character who only appears in the film for like 2 or 3 minutes. But I do think having that kind of very limited perspective on what it means to even be a man kind of has Adam on this path of what will benefit me the most, what will help me assimilate into this group. And I think what starts off as like an awkward misunderstanding, he just kind of rolls with it because it gets him attention. Now, at this point, alarm bells are going off for you. Isn't this like really shitty and offensive? I would say yes, almost definitely. But I think what people tend to disregard for some reason is that the film also thinks this. This film isn't like great. It's a great thing that this is what Adam is doing. Now, that's not to say that it's always careful in the way that it shows this kind of behavior. I think particularly when it comes to sex in the film, it can feel a bit leery, especially when it comes to Gillian. So I think that is kind of worth taking into account. To what extent is the camera also inviting us into this kind of sexual fantasy that Adam is having? One of my key frustrations is that making a film problematic as like its key word is simplifying it and not allowing actual discussion to be had, which is limiting, but it also cuts out all of the nuance that's here in the story, which is that this film is specifically about performing gender and the way that cis people kind of believe that they don't have to keep up that performance, and in having to pretend to be a trans man, the audience is kind of asked to see the extent that that isn't true, that what is seen to come easily actually might not be the case. Another thing, and this is kind of like a conspiracy theory that I've seen floating around, that I don't want to give too much weight because there isn't a ton of evidence of this theory, but it is interesting. I think that the description of the film is that Adam is cis and straight. So everyone took that to mean Adam is cis and straight, and therefore that is what is happening with the film. There are kind of fringe theories that Adam might actually not be cis and straight, and that this whole thing might have been him dipping his toe, albeit in a really kind of shitty, exploitative way, into the community where he might actually fit in some way. Now, because the film is not really definitive about that, and like I said, it is a theory in that he's not very good at performing masculinity, and he seems to feel as though he is inadequate in himself, and he says to another man, I think it's Ethan, "You're like every girl's dream," which when when he said that, I was like, that's a really gay thing to say. Is there something you wanted to tell us? But I think the frustrating part about discussing this film is that I don't think many people even considered that fact, that this whole kind of performance might actually be a closeted queer and trans person attempting in the only way they know how to be a part of a community that they wouldn't be able to find back home. I think a lot of the behaviour that he has to engage with functions as like lessons in empathy, because he has to seek advice from like fringe communities. By that I mean like looking up testosterone and top surgery videos on YouTube in the way that I think many trans masculine people will have had to do in the early 2000s. Here is a criticism overshadowed by the simplified "this film was problematic, end of discussion," is that Adam very much uses the people around him as ways to become a better person, which is true of most, if not all, coming-of-age stories. But the way it functions in the film is that actual marginalised people don't get to go back to their lives. And this is somewhat dealt with, not enough in my opinion. I don't think he is justly punished for his actions. An example of this, he's very kind of cruel to Ethan, who is a trans man living stealth. Adam kind of uses Ethan as a information point where he can go and get advice about being a trans man and having sex with a woman, but he doesn't have to deal with the consequences that Ethan does, such as being rejected, like actually rejected for who he is, specifically by women that he wants to date. Ethan has the opposite problem of Adam, where when he comes out as trans, that is considered a massive betrayal, whereas for a lot of the film, I don't know that Adam views his own behaviour as particularly nefarious, because for him it seems that the ends justify the means. This film is very much trying to be an inversion of what we expect from these kinds of stories. So in being a satire, it has to take the character of the trans person in a mainstream film and inverts that so that they're no longer the outsider, but the means for community. Whereas cisness and straightness is very much othered. It's a film where queerness and transness isn't hidden, but cis and straightness is. And I think a lot of the pushback has a lot to do with tone. I think the film is played too straight, and that's a big problem when you're doing satire, because I think that is an actually interesting theme of the Down with Cis bus, where a bunch of trans people rule the roost and you are the outsider, the stinky little cis boy who should know his fucking place. This is a comedy. I think it could have had like a but I'm a cheerleader kind of vibe, where in order to fit in this world, being trans is what's cool. Now, that could have still been very offensive, but I think a lot of people were calling this like anti-LGBT propaganda. They were calling it like a conversion narrative, which I think are all like a lot. It's like a lot to put on this film, especially because most of the characters in the film have very transitory, nebulous identities. There are some people who are like, I'm definitely a trans man, or I'm definitely a lesbian. But many of the characters do not like deliberately label themselves. And I think that's a lot to do with the setting of the film. It's set in 2006. So I imagine it seems to be a film about the nebulousness of identity and what communities in 2006 New York, a very specific location, would offer these kinds of people, and what it means to perform trans masculinity in these spaces and what is expected of trans men in these spaces as well. I'm going to get into that more later, but I think the idea of our identities being a performance, that we have to kind of zhuzh them up a bit in order to get people to be on our side, kind of feels familiar, like how on the internet, in many queer spaces, people like clear-cut labels for everything, even when those don't fit really for a lot of people, and they can actually feel very limiting. But we've kind of been moving a lot towards those. This film feels more potent than, I guess, people gave it credit for, and I think it's more of just being caught up in the initial shock of what the film is actually about, which, for better or worse, kind of shot the film into people's eyesights. I just think like the complicated nature of being a human with a gender and sexuality is interesting here, and I will give the film credit for it.
I have to tell you something.
Okay.
I kind of let Jillian think I was a trans guy.
What?
When we first met, she assumed it, and I let her keep on assuming it.
Do you even get how fucked up that is? You used a marginalized identity to have sex. I mean, who does that? This is too creepy. Here, just, I'm out.
Ethan, please.
Did you ever even tell her?
Yes, I told her. She said she knew.
What does that mean?
I don't know, okay? I don't know. We got caught up in some weird stuff. Look, I did a stupid, awful thing, and I'm sorry.
I wanted to talk about what this film has to say about culture vultures and appropriating marginalization, which has actually come up quite a few times on this podcast. The idea that in order to solidify a character's victim status to themselves, but also sometimes to the audience. What a main character will have to do is make themselves seem as though they are experiencing more oppression than they probably are. What we know from the script, what we know from Ariel Schrag's script, is that she was adapting her own novel to make a film flipping the trans deception trope on its head. So she said in an interview that it was poking fun at, but also challenging cis people's obsession with transness. If you look at the world right now, feels kind of appropriate because trans people are like always in the news. Yet I doubt many cis people actually know a trans person, like really actually. So despite the fact that they are in fact a minority, like very literally a minority, they are everywhere and they're coming to get you. They're coming to steal the batteries out of your remotes and fill up your drain pipes with sand. There is an idea of what it means to actually be oppressed, I think feels quite nebulous in cis people's minds, where being trans is simply doing the part of gender and then going home. Then that's it. I think it doesn't function as a whole identity in people's minds. This person, Adam, he views himself as an awkward outcast who is unable to attract and seduce women, and he doesn't have many friends, and he hangs out with his sister who also kind of struggles to keep a partner for a long time. She's flitting between people. She's constantly ending up with people who do not want to be monogamous. What we see from these two characters is the way that they kind of both change themselves to attract people. So for Adam, he pretends to be trans, and for Casey, she, I guess, just kind of goes along with whatever situation is at hand. So if there are going to be pretty women at a protest, she's going to go to a protest. If her girlfriend is going to a BDSM party, then she's going to be at that party. And it is insinuated that she isn't particularly comfortable simply being herself. And I think what we can sense is just like constant emanating cis insecurity about the comfortableness. I'm using a lot of like pretend words that don't feel real, that trans people in the film seem to have with their own identities and with their abilities to find, keep, and maintain friendships and relationships that just aren't afforded to them within the context of this film. And I think that, in their eyes, is a kind of marginalization. Am I making the argument that this is kind of an incel film? Yes. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. It is interesting that simply not getting what you want is how Adam's victim status, self-assigned victim status, is how it comes about. He wants to have friends and he wants to have a girlfriend. The fact that he doesn't is why we should be feeling sorry for him. And I think as the film goes along, it's asking us, is this correct? Is this point of view that this teenage boy is giving to us, is this actually what's happening? Now, I think we can question the extent that this is positioned as nefarious. Like I said, it's a subjective point of view. He is presented as being simply too awkward to correct people who mistake him for being trans. Is it a problem that he doesn't turn to the camera and go, wahahaha, and twirl his mustache and be like, I'm actually very, very evil? Is that a problem? Or is it enough that he very legitimately hurts people's feelings, that he goes to a camp meant for trans people, potentially taking another trans person's place? Is it presenting it as a problem that he keeps it up for pretty much the whole summer? As an audience member, you kind of have to be a little bit responsible for the way you interpret a text. And if someone is doing something shitty, then you can just like work that out for yourself. I think it could be a bit clearer, but asking the film to fully disavow this character kind of undermines everything that it's saying about gender and the structural advantages that a cis, straight, white teenage boy from a middle-class family would have in this situation. Like, he can just nope out. Like, he can just leave. He doesn't have to live this life if he doesn't want to. And I think that's a big part of the film. But at the same time, it's very clearly making fun of the way that cis, straight people expect trans and queer people to perform their identities. There has to be a coming out sequence. There has to be this like sob story. And Adam, by proxy, is made to experience those things. He has to practice coming out in the bathroom before he actually does it. I think being conflict averse is like a real thing. I'm someone who's also conflict averse. And I think many people in the LGBT community are as well, which feels a bit ironic, I think, because the inability to engage with this film kind of prevents you from watching a film about someone who refuses to engage with the truth, even when it would benefit the people around them. So, like, being conflict averse is kind of a major part of being in LGBT spaces online. You know, if critical analysis was better in people, I think they might actually find something to like about it. This is really mean. I might not keep this in. In all the hubbub about Adam, people don't talk about Gillian, who is very much dealing with her own kind of nebulous and complicated sexual orientation. Apparently, Gillian was based on a real teenage girl who wasn't allowed to go to prom with her girlfriend. There's a situation in the beginning of the film where Adam is rejected by a girl that he might want to do some sex stuff with, but he ends up being rejected. And this, for him, is kind of like a catalyst moment to like get the fuck out of his boring town and go to the big city. And this is like a choice for him. Gillian kind of doesn't have that choice. She didn't get that choice. That choice was made for her. So we see the ways that oppression has very much tangibly negatively affected the people in this group. And the ways that Adam is just kind of using this as a way to make himself a better person. You know, he's being shitty now, but he's gonna be a good ally later. Ugh. I think the appropriation of oppressive experiences is a tool for Adam. He very much uses the trans people in his life as a way to like find himself. And if I am going to like very heavily criticize the film, I will say that I don't think he's reprimanded enough for this. I think he's kind of let off, which, you know, might in itself be evidence of his privilege, that he's probably never going to be punished for the events of this film. But yeah, I at least wish like Ethan had thrown soup in his face or something. More punishment for Adam. That is my perspective. I think the film like holds firm on that people who appropriate other people's culture often will not face the consequences of living in that identity.
Huh? What would the problem be?
Like, women only, Pip?
I'm sure it's fine. Bond is totally cool with trans folks.
Cool. Yeah, they just somewhat like nasty bio straight men getting up on lesbians.
Some flack that this film got was the way that it presented lesbian identity as malleable and subject to change because of the idea that a lesbian could be in a relationship and have sex with a trans man and I guess like still be a lesbian. But again, I think I said this earlier, there's a kind of flattening out of history and the ways that these terms have come to be, but also like the history of the way lesbian identity and trans masculine identity have been intertwined. I'm probably not the best person to talk about it from experience because I'm neither of these things, but the director is a trans man and he gave an interview with The Stranger. So I'm going to read what he had to say. I actually lived in Bushwick in 2006 and was part of the queer, trans, lesbian community. I was in all those spaces. I really recognised the world. I really recognised the characters. I really recognised the language, which is kind of horrifically outdated in some ways. One thing that keeps coming up that I found kind of surprising is that there are a lot of young queer and trans folks on the internet who have really pointed out that the movie depicts a lesbian dating a trans guy. They say, well, that would never happen and it's inherently transphobic because it suggests that a trans guy isn't a real guy. I've been really scratching my head over that one because I'm a trans guy. I used to date lesbians and I came up through the lesbian scene. If you're around in the mid-2000s or before, you knew that lesbians dating trans guys was incredibly common. That was practically the norm. Or the default. It's kind of amazing that the particular issue has generated such blowback from people who are just shocked that could ever happen. There's a really good example of a generational disconnect. I'm also going to read a quote from the screenwriter and author of the original book, Ariel Schrag, who again, was writing from her own experiences when she wrote the original novel. Schrag said that she wrote the novel Adam and then the screenplay about her own experiences in queer and trans circles in New York City in the mid-aughts, a time when ideas about gender and sexual fluidity were much more limited. So everybody was kind of struggling, she said. Someone might transition and then their partner would say, do I still get to be a lesbian? Am I straight now? I wanted to explore that in the novel, especially in a way that was hopefully accessible to cis straight people, but it's more of an insider novel. There are more inside jokes for the people within the community, exposing our own hypocrisies. I talked about Casey a bit earlier, but I'm going to circle back to her now because I think she's also kind of a good example because I guess Adam kind of perceives her as a lesbian. So in the beginning of the film, he's kind of incredulous when she says that she's told her parents that she's staying with Mark, her boyfriend, when Adam knows that she's gay. So this is obviously a lie. As we come to know her, we see that she describes herself as queer, and like many of the queer women in the film, they seem to date other women and trans men. And this is like quite consistent. It's quite a consistent opinion. It's also very much an opinion that circulates online every now and again of queer women, bisexual women, sometimes lesbians as well, saying that they would only date women and trans men. Another kind of significant piece to really solidify the time period is The L Word, which as a landmark show really brought lesbians and trans men together. Is it for the correct reasons? Who knows? But I think there is this like idea of this is the only place we can be represented, and even if it's kind of shitty, like we see characters in the show making fun of the way that it represents trans men in the show, it's a community kind of experience to criticize something for misrepresenting a specific experience, which, you know, it kind of brings everything all around. Shitting on this movie is what brought a lot of trans people together. So maybe it was for the good of everything. I guess the reason I keep like circling around this is that trans men, and I can only go from like the anecdotal evidence of the people making the film and also what's represented in the film, but also just like historical accounts of like trans men have been kind of enmeshed in lesbian spaces, and the identity of being a trans man has kind of been like a nebulous kind of masculinity that's viewed as safe enough for lesbians to pursue as like a test to see whether they are attracted to men or not. And this is still kind of true today. Transmasculine people being viewed as a lesser version of a man, or like not really a man, or like a man but you're like very heavily winking and pointing to your eye being like, I'm winking, because we all know that we're all pretending to go along with this because this is like not what we think of when we think of like the man, like the oppressive man. Trans men in the film are like excluded from the jabs made at cis men's expense. And I think there is a kind of potent criticism in the film of the way that lesbians fetishize trans men, and also a criticism of the way that they perceive maleness when it comes to trans men. So Gillian admits at the end of the film that she was kind of using Adam as an experiment, as a way to kind of defer from referring to herself as bisexual or queer. It's like pushing down her attraction to men and maintaining that she is a lesbian by only being attracted to trans men, and the way that that kind of not only problematizes the label of lesbian, but also the masculinity of trans men. And that's the kind of stuff that you don't get when you don't engage with the film in a nuanced and meaningful way, because I think a lot of the way this film ends is characters coming to terms with the ways that they're really prejudiced, and then there isn't much resolution to that. Like, I don't think they get redeemed, really. I wouldn't even really say Adam gets redeemed, because he's still kind of presented as a dumb kid who definitely shouldn't have done the things that he's done. Its open-endedness is indicative of it being an indie film. I think there is kind of elusiveness to the independent film where you don't necessarily have to resolve everything, and I think that kind of informs the ways that it doesn't fully reprimand Adam for his actions. But I think it all comes down to like the way that we all perceive gender and our own biases when it comes to deciding what is good and what is bad for the community we live in. With all that in mind, does this film look like a badger? There was a massive amount of controversy regarding the production of this film, which, despite my defense of it, which is only in terms of I think it should be allowed to be analysed in a meaningful way, is not me excusing the behaviour of people on set, and I don't think the mistreatment of actors should be swept under the rug, even if a lot of queer and trans people were involved with making it. In terms of the actual content of the film, it's an indie film that is mostly plotless and doesn't really treat its side characters with much dignity. There's very little resolution, and whilst Adam is chastised, the whole film is positioned as a learning experience for him, and he doesn't really have to reckon with the consequences of his actions. I did personally find the inversion of the queer outsider, where there is one cis straight person in a sea of queerness, to be really interesting. I think Adam's own perceived victimhood is called into question when he has to reckon with the consequences of being queer. His coming of age story feels like him using marginalised people as a stepping stone to being a better person, which is probably also true of real life. There isn't enough representation of the way transmasculine people are simultaneously fetishized and demeaned by queer women, who they are explicitly and implicitly said to not be real men, and therefore allowed inside women-only spaces, something that's very controversial right now, with the Out and Proud TERF movement seeking to invalidate and harm trans people by presenting trans women as predators and trans men as lost women who need to be guided back to womanhood. It's a film that has its roots in truth, but does fail to come together as anything that transgressive. In spite of the controversy surrounding the film, its biggest critics are people who haven't watched it, which is very annoying when it comes to engaging with analysis of the film. I have talked for so long. I'm so sorry. Oh God. Okay. I'm going to give you some recommendations and then send you on your way, because my goodness. So the first film that I'm going to recommend is a short film. It's called Here With You, and it was directed by Noah Scamus. It follows two trans people who meet at a housewarming party and decide to spend the night together. It's very sweet and it's straight and to the point. It's very cute, and it's also directed and starring trans people. This next recommendation is going to sound completely out of left field, but I promise it's relevant. It's a film called Helter Skelter. This is a Japanese film, and it's all about the performance of gender. It's very different tonally to this film. It's about Liliko, who is an icon in Japan, who has had her entire body remodeled so that she can maintain her popularity. But when this is threatened, she begins to feel like she's losing control of her career and her body. It has everything. It's colourful, it's got evil gays in it, it's weird as shit. It's the polar opposite vibe to this film and possibly just as offensive with its evil, sexy, bisexual representation. I personally think it's great and underrated, and watch it. Just do it. We are officially done now. I will leave you to go on your way. I want to thank you very much for listening. I'm going to do my next episode in October on queer horror. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure you follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgerPod. Follow this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can find my writing at ambergunwalk.com. You can donate to my coffee, which I'll put in the description. Everything that I've referenced is also in the description. I want to thank you again for listening, and I will see you in October.